Oh, well, hello, everyone. Thank you all so much for joining me today. My name is Taylor Sawyer. I'll discuss a little bit more about who I am in a few seconds. But today we're going to be talking about strawberries, a little bit different than the last presenter. So for today's presentation, I'm going to outline where we're at right now and where we're going to be headed in the next 45 minutes. So I'll start with a brief introduction about myself, and then I will get into my first year of my PhD research, which encompasses the topic of photosynthesis within a greenhouse experiment. And then I'll discuss where I'll be headed in the next 3 years as I continue along my PhD journey. Surprise, my name is Taylor. I'm headed into my second year of my PhD in the plant breeding graduate program at the University of Florida. This past spring in 2023, I graduated with my Bachelor's of Science in Biotechnology and jumped right into a PhD. So I'm very excited to be here with you all today and to talk about what I've been up to. So for the first section of this presentation, I'm going to talk about some of the research that I collected and analyzed within a greenhouse environment. And this kind of set the foundation for the first year of my PhD and how I can build off of this foundation. So strawberry, specifically strawberry in the United States, is one of the most economically important specialty crops of all of the fruits, due to its essential nutrients and antioxidant properties that are vital for a healthy human diet. In 2020, global strawberry production valued at $14 billion. So this is a really valuable commodity for not only the United States, but for the world. And because of this, the United States is the second largest global producer of strawberry, second to China. And Florida is the largest producer of winter strawberries. So in the state of Florida, we produce strawberries between January and March. So that's peak season for us. I would have brought strawberries if it was peak season right now, but every time you're at the grocery store, chances are you're probably eating strawberries from California or from Florida. But even though strawberry is such an important commodity for Florida, production still faces a lot of challenges that negatively impact farmers' rate of production. And because of this, strawberry is a very vulnerable crop due to fluctuations in the international market. They deal with lots of extreme climatic environments, with Florida being such a hot state. And lastly, strawberry is susceptible to a lot of disease pressure. And this can lead to decreased yields, which is a huge problem as our population continues to increase. And because our population is continuing to increase, people like me who are plant breeders need to meet the demand with our supply. So we need to come up with a fast and substantial improvement to these decreases as a way to continue increasing production. And on the right here, you can see our research fields in the state of Florida. That is at the Gulf Coast Research and Education Center located in Plant City, so about 2.5 hours south of here. A potential solution to our declining yields, it lies within strawberry physiology. So how strawberry is able to convert energy into fruit production. And one of the ways we can do this is through the process of photosynthesis. You might have heard of photosynthesis before. So photosynthesis is the conversion of light energy into chemical energy. So all plants are able to take water, minerals, sunlight, and carbon dioxide as a way to produce glucose or sugar and oxygen molecules. So because every plant is constantly photosynthesizing while the sun is up, maybe people like me who are plant breeders can utilize this biological process and exploit it as a way to increase production. So you might be wondering, Taylor, that seems like such a rudimentary concept. Why has no one done this before? Well, in other specialty crops such as rice, this has been done, but strawberry is one of the most recently domesticated crops, only being domesticated in the 18th century. So in other studies conducted in rice paddy, utilizing photosynthesis as a way to increase fruit production has already been done. And we've seen successful targeting of photosynthesis as a way to increase yields through some of these experimental studies. We've also seen in other studies, such as corn, that selecting plants that are more efficient with their resources, so resources such as water and carbon dioxide, have a greater improvement of yield by up to 30%. So, why should we be doing this in strawberry? Well, previous studies show that strawberry is performing only half of what other C3 crops, C3 being the way that different plants can convert carbon dioxide into oxygen and sugar. So strawberry is only half as productive as other plants such as rice, cassava, and cowpea. And the reason for this is maybe because strawberry is super complex. So in the human genome, we have 46 chromosomes with 2 copies of each chromosome, but strawberry have 8 copies. So because of how complex strawberries are, this is another reason why maybe we haven't done this before in this type of crop. So the aim of my research is to figure out what this variation between plants are. So kind of in the way that my genetics are different from Walter's genetics, strawberries are the same way. So each plant is comprised of different genetics. So we want to see what this variation is between plants and make selections for the ones that are performing at a higher rate. So that's the first research aim. And the second research aim is once we're able to identify which strawberry plants are the most effective, then how can we figure out how it's being effective in terms of yield production and efficiency? With the overarching goal being we want to harness this variation as a way to improve strawberry and guide breeding strategies for sustainable water use, especially in places like California that are experiencing drought, and also to help farmers increase their yields with such low profit margins. So for my first experiment, what I did was I took commercial cultivars. So what those are is once plants are identified as having superior traits, they are commercialized and released under a name. So in Florida, we have like Florida Radiance, we have Brilliance, Medallion. So they're given a name and those are sold to farmers. And those are the crops that are elite and are being planted on their actual farms. So I took 5 of these commercial cultivars, 5 advanced selections. So advanced selections are right before they're commercialized. It's that stage right before. And 7 wild species. So some of these species were collected from Missouri, Peru, Chile, South Carolina. So I wanted to look at the variation between our commercial releases that are supposed to be the elites and also wild varieties of strawberry. Then I analyzed how these different types of strawberry plants were performing under different light concentrations and carbon concentrations. So going back to the process of photosynthesis, when the plants are converting light and carbon dioxide into sugar and fruit essentially, I wanted to see how manipulating some of these concentrations would affect overall production and efficiency. To do this, I used a really fancy piece of equipment. It's called a Lycor 6400 XT portable photosynthesis machine. And it's a really fascinating apparatus where it has a headpiece and I can clamp down, as you can see here, on the leaflet of the strawberry. And you're able to manipulate the amount of light that the leaf is receiving and also the amount of carbon dioxide within the chamber. And so the machine is able to calculate how much light and gas is entering the chamber and then calculate the difference as it exits as a way to measure how efficient these leaves are responding to the environment. And so here's where it starts to get a little bit complex. So what we're looking at here are the results of the study. On our x-axis, we have increasing light concentration, starting from 0 all the way up to 2000. On our y-axis here, we have the rate of photosynthesis, so how chemically active these plants are. Each line represents a different variety that I tested in my study, and this gray area is what our atmospheric conditions look like on a day-to-day basis in a field in Florida. And so breaking this down, we're able to see variation in between the lines. So these are variation in between the different types of plants. And as a plant breeder, we're looking for this type of variation to see which plants we can select that are the most efficient and effective. And so taking a look at these top two lines here, I started to analyze further into their origin, and these are wild plant species. One of them coming from Peru at 4,000 meters of elevation, and one coming from South Carolina at 141 meters of elevation. So this is something that I'm still currently working on. I'm not exactly sure why these wild species are performing photosynthesis at a rate higher than even our elite varieties, but it's really fascinating to know that maybe as we've commercialized strawberry over the last 200 years, as we're selecting for traits such as disease resistance and efficiency, maybe we're deselecting for other traits. So this is something I want to look in further to see why this is happening, why our elite selections aren't performing as well as the wild species are. And in this next figure, this is the results of the carbon dioxide study. So on our y-axis, we can see the increasing rate of carbon dioxide that I set within the chamber. And on our y-axis, we can see the rate of photosynthesis. And a similar concept to the last graph, each line is a different plant variety. And we see a similar ranking between the light and the carbon dioxide responses with those two top performing genotypes from South Carolina and Peru at the very top. So once again, I'm not sure why chemically this is happening, but this is a really interesting finding that's never been seen before in strawberry. And so now my job is to figure out why this is happening. Okay, no worries. How does this one sound? Good? Okay, perfect. So, as I briefly mentioned, the results of this study is that our wild plant varieties that were collected in South Carolina and Peru are the top performing varieties. So we wanted to see this variation in between the plants that were selected because maybe these wild species have a greater stress tolerance or are performing more efficiently than maybe some of our commercial releases. And how does this translate to yield in the field? So they're very chemically efficient. We want to make sure this actually translates to the amount of fruit produced. Next, we want to harness this diversity between individuals that might have been lost through commercialization over the last 200 years, and maybe figure out what genes are responsible for this and reintegrating it back into our breeding program. So for this study, some future directions is to harness the genes that are responsible for this increased efficiency and trying to understand these limitations that exist in our commercial varieties versus our wild introductions. I also think it's very fascinating too. So at the very top here is what wild strawberry looks like. So that's Fragaria chiloensis. And then this bottom picture here is Fragaria virginiana. So these are what wild strawberries look like versus what we normally think of strawberry plants having nice, luscious, conical fruit. This is what it used to look like 200 years ago. So these are the plants that are photosynthesizing and converting light into sugar at a greater rate than some of the commercial releases that our program has commercialized. So moving forward, as I think about the next 3 years of my PhD, I really wanted to understand how I can integrate this data into something that could be long lasting, if that makes sense. And one way to do this is to develop a crop growth model. So essentially what a crop growth model is it's a way for plant breeders to use mathematical equations as a way to predict how plants are going to respond in different environments. And so we can do this using some computer softwares where we can input different characteristics of strawberry, for example. We can input weather data, soil data, water data, so how much the plants are being irrigated, as a way to predict how plants are going to perform in the future without actually having to plant them in the field. Additionally, a new concept in genetics is whole genome prediction. So as I previously mentioned, each one of us is unique. We all have different genes. And it's the same for strawberries. They all have different genes. And so there's a way for us to predict how a plant will perform for a specified trait by understanding its genetic composition. So we can leverage these two ideas, so these mathematical equations that are responsible for understanding how plants can perform, and also leveraging a plant's genetics as a way to make models that can predict how the plants will respond in the field without actually having to plant them. We can do this in a computer software system. This is really dynamic because as we release new plant varieties, we can integrate the genetic component into these models and run new predictions. Or as weather fluctuates in Florida versus in California, we can input these different weather information to understand how the plants will respond. But to do this, we need large, high quality data sets. Encompassing 3 areas. So we need to know the physiology. So data like this can be from my photosynthesis study, or we can use flowering information. So how many flowers the plants produce in different stages of the season. We can also use the genetic information of the individuals. So as I was mentioning, understanding its genetics can be integrated into the model. And lastly, using environmental data such as solar radiation, temperature, humidity. We can integrate all of those together as a way to get a comprehensive understanding of how the plants will respond. So this has been done a lot in corn, but hasn't been done in strawberry. And as the world is changing and artificial intelligence is becoming more prominent, agriculture needs to keep up and also begin to integrate AI. So if we're able to make these prediction models, we can keep up and respond faster and faster, and we can release elite plant varieties at a quicker rate than what we've done in the past. So AI can help us make these predictions about which plants will be top performers and which won't be. And this can guide the breeders' strategies to actually make crosses between plants that will be the most productive and most efficient. So who cares? Why is this important? So this is really important because it takes a very long time to breed elite strawberries. And between you and me, it doesn't seem like it would take a long time, but to really get a plant that's going to be the most effective, that's going to keep up with the supply that's demanded by our population, we need to have these top performing varieties and accelerate the cycle to releasing elite varieties. And so if we're able to select the top performing varieties and integrate that with artificial intelligence, we can have a more streamlined, data-driven decision-making process. The broader impacts of this study is, as I previously mentioned, artificial intelligence is becoming more and more prevalent in our society. So agriculture needs to keep up with this change in pace. We also can improve yields for a growing population so that we always have strawberry readily accessible to us in the grocery store, and a way that we can be adaptive in agriculture to different environments in a continuously changing environment. Thank you so much. That was my presentation on my PhD research so far. I would love to take any questions.
Wonderful. I have a question, and since I have a microphone, I can do that first. Your machine was looking at the leaves and the transposition of the carbon dioxide and the photosynthesis into the leaf. How do you transfer that information into the plant fruit as opposed to just the leaf?
Yes. So when I'm controlling the atmosphere around the leaf and I'm making an inference about how the plant is responding to the light and the carbon dioxide, there's an equation for photosynthesis. So the conversion of carbon dioxide and light into sugar, and then sugar gets allocated to leaf production and also fruit production. So I don't know the exact percentage of how much of that sugar is going to the fruit, but some of it is also going to the leaf.
Right. Okay, I see hand up.
You hands.
Some of us were lucky enough to hear from one of your colleagues about picking the fruit, that using IA to help them pick the fruit that people actually liked. And so instead of having like 300 varieties, they could get it down to 30 varieties. And then people actually tasted them. So this is very interesting. Now we're seeing where the varieties are coming from. Do you integrate with them after you get this information? And have some fruit? Do you pass it along to that group and then they check it out, or is this more just scientific research at this point?
So at this point, this is more just scientific research, and a lot of times in academia, groups don't work together, unfortunately. That's just by the nature of research. So while other groups are doing something similar at the end of the production stages by using AI as a way to pick the fruits that people like, I'm not directly collaborating with them. So this is something a little bit separate.
I have two questions.
Yes.
The first one is are the leaves edible and are they nutritional? And the second question is, do you raise organic strawberries or not?
For the first question, so the leaves technically are edible. However, we don't eat them. So I'm not exactly sure what their nutritional content looks like, but you could eat them if you wanted to. They probably wouldn't be very tasty, but you definitely could eat them. And as far as organic goes, so the University of Florida does not make genetically modified plants. I'm not sure if that would be classified as organic, because I think organic has to do more with the actual pesticide usage. And I do the breeding strategies. I don't do like management of production. So I'm not exactly sure what that end looks like. But as far as breeding, we do not breed genetically modified plants.
Right.
So many questions. I love it.
When you say that you're looking at top performing, okay. Oh, all right. Hello.
Hi.
Interesting talk. When you say top performing, I'm a little confused as to what your actual metrics are. Is it purely yield, or are you looking at yield per amount of water use, or yield per amount of chemicals put on the soil? So could you explain that a little better? What are your metrics for defining a good plant?
So for this study, the metrics that I'm defining as a top performing plant would be the ones that are photosynthesizing at a higher rate. And so I made this inference because there's been studies that have shown that photosynthesis and yield are correlated with one another, which when we're thinking about photosynthesis, that does make sense because if we're converting, if the plants are converting light energy into chemical energy, it would make sense that some of those chemicals are being allocated to the fruit. However, it kind of depends on what the purpose of the breeding program is as to define a good plant. So for some, a good plant could be a plant that is tolerant to disease. Or for others, a good plant is one that has really flavorful fruits. Or to another, a good plant could be, has very symmetrical, round shaped fruit. But for this current study, it's the ones that are photosynthesizing at a higher rate. And that's kind of the trade-off in plant breeding is when we focus on one trait, our attention is diverted from those other really important traits for consumers. So it's finding a way to balance which traits we're looking at and how we can reach a perfect harmony to make the best plant for commercial production.
Hi.
Hi.
That was very interesting. Earlier in the year, we had from IFAS a talk on blueberries.
Okay. I used to work in blueberries.
Definitely, that's been a success of IFAS in developing and producing wonderful, luscious blueberries. And I think strawberries are wonderful too this year. They are in excess. My question is this. Your basic hypothesis is there's a correlation between photosynthesis and fruit and
Correct.
yield. So you already have a built-in or already available model to test that out because you have two species or two varieties that are high photosynthesis,
Right.
do they produce more? It's easy to look at, is it not?
It is easy to look at. I actually just finished analyzing this data only like last week. So I haven't yet looked at what the actual yields are for these two plants. But in a way, it almost kind of doesn't matter what the yield is going to be because those two plants are native species. So if you remember the photos that I showed, the fruits are going to be very small. And what matters more is what genes are responsible for the plants producing at such a high rate. So we can take those genes and integrate it back into our plants that are more modern that make much larger fruit.
Yeah, that's for improving the cultivar, let's
Yes.
say. But just as a scientific theory, it's easy to test the yield versus photosynthesis correlation.
Right. Yes.
Right
Yeah.
now, you already have the data, and you said you have looked at it, you've collected the data.
So previous studies have shown that yield and photosynthesis are related to one another. And I do have the field data for the yields. I just haven't put all the pieces together.
Or strawberries. So
Yes.
that's true also for other fruits, other like blueberries or berries.
I can't speak for all fruit, but I can speak for blueberry because I used to work in blueberry,
Yeah,
but I can't speak for all fruits.
yeah. And for rice, of course, that was the original.
Yes, of course.
Um, the the blueberries are not interested in being tasteful for human beings. They want to produce more seeds so that they can produce more strawberries, right? Uh, but the taste of strawberries is, of course, important for how well they sell to the public. But can you tell us something more about what the flavor of strawberries consists of? I mean, there must be flavonoids or something besides just sugar. It's not just sugar, right?
Right. Yeah. So it's very complex, and flavor is not something that I study, but one of my colleagues in my lab does study flavor. So it would be like flavonoids or I'm blanking on some of the other chemical components, but yes, it's multifaceted. It's not just glucose. It's a lot of other chemical compositions. So that's what's really important too in science is that even though that's not my area of focus, that's something I'm considering. So you could have a super efficient, high yielding plant, but if it tastes like crap, no one's going to buy it. So it's really important that we're balancing, it's like a scale that we're balancing all of these different aspects with one another to create the best product for the consumer. Another analogy I really love too about strawberry is that strawberry is kind of like a water balloon. And so the bigger the fruit gets, the more water is going to be within it. So it's also a trade off there too, because you don't want the fruits to be too large, because then the ratio from water to sugar is going to decrease and it won't taste as good. So yes, we want high yielding, but that doesn't mean we want giant fruits. It's a trade-off. Like we want more fruits, but it gets more and more complex because the more fruits you have on a plant, now all of the sugar the plants are producing is being distributed into more fruit. So also you're decreasing the amount of sugar and other chemical components to each fruit. So it's very complex, and that's why it's not just a one person show. It's a team of all of us working together in these different aspects, and then how we can come together to make the best product.
Hi. Curiously, you have not yet mentioned pollinators. And pollinators are an important part of this equation, both attracting them. And so anyway, I wanted to know who are the normal pollinators of strawberries? Do they differ for cultivated ones as opposed to the wild ones? And yeah, just tell me about the pollinators on of strawberries.
Sure, that's a great question. So the pollinators of strawberries are bees. I'm not sure if So I'm not exactly sure which type of bee, whether it's like a bumblebee or like, yeah, I'm not sure which type of bee. That's a good question that I'll definitely need to look into. But what I do know about strawberry and pollinators is that once the pollinator is attracted to the flower and pollinates the flower, most of the time that flower does become a fruit. So in other fruit species, we have aborted fruits. So the fruits won't actually set to produce a fruit. They'll just kind of like drop off, but that doesn't happen in strawberry. So that is a really good question that I'll have to look into.
He wants to know, do you use bees or something else to pollinate them?
Bees are the primary pollinators in the open field production. So we're not hand pollinating. But in some other species, like when I worked in blueberry, we did do hand pollinations. And then also when we're crossing parents in the greenhouse for strawberry, they do use hand pollination to make sure that the parents are the exact parents that they want. So they'll use like a Q-tip to pollinate it, but then in the actual field, once the plants are planted, bees are the primary pollinators. Yes.
Hi. I'm sorry, I don't know a lot about strawberries. So could you take a minute and just talk about the plant? How long do they produce within a year? Are they all year? I'm trying to associate the photosynthesis turning into sugar, turning into fruit,
Mhm.
if in fact the wild ones, for example, only fruit for 2 weeks and that's it.
Mhm.
So could you talk a little bit about that as well?
Yeah, of course. So in strawberry, there's two different types of production. So there's June bearing and there's ever bearing. So for these plants, we only are harvesting at one time point in the year. And for Florida production, that's throughout the winter months. But in wild species, they're actually producing fruit continuously throughout the year, but those fruit are much, much smaller. And so also when we think of the Florida production window, we're in a international trade market competing with other countries like Mexico and China. And so it's really important that Florida holds the domestic production for strawberries so that we can maximize farmer profits. But as I mentioned, some types of strawberries can continuously push out fruit throughout the year. But in the Florida market, it's only at one time point in those winter months.
Other questions? I have a couple.
Of course.
Years ago, when I was working, I would fly into LA and drive up to Oxnard and catch a helicopter out to the island for my research. But around Oxnard, there are thousands of acres of laser leveled fields that are artificially irrigated. And you could go by any little stand and you could pick up a whole bunch of strawberries for nearly nothing. Is that the competition for the Florida strawberry market?
So Florida and California, to my knowledge, don't really compete with one another just because Florida really produces during the winter time. So we don't really have to worry about California. It's mostly some of the international production that we have to worry about. And also to the timing of production is very important. So from a week to week basis, the price of strawberry is fluctuating. And so we want to make sure that production is early, so like around January, so that we can get the highest price possible for strawberry and that we are flooding the market with Florida strawberry versus strawberry from China or Mexico.
Thank you. And then another question was related to my experience trying to grow strawberries. I had a little plot and I bought them, and I planted them, but the next year they seemed to have reverted back to their original strain and they had the tiny little berries that were not very tasty. I failed.
Maybe did you fertilize them?
I doubt it. So do you have a problem with reversion? And you were talking about not genetically modified, but then you talked about inserting genes from one to another. Is that only by crossbreeding you're trying to get those genes in, but not introducing?
Correct. Yeah. So it'd be through crossbreeding, not through inserting the genes. So as I mentioned, not genetically modified, but we would take two parents that contain the traits that we'd want, and we'd cross those through pollination, hand pollination, and then the offspring would hopefully contain both of the traits that we're looking for, or one of the traits of interest.
Okay, so I did that, and I have like 20 plants that I'm dealing with in your lab and your greenhouse and all of that. How many years is it until you get about 25,000 plants that you can put out in the field?
Ooh, a long time. No, the UF strawberry breeding program, we use a nursery, I want to say in Washington or Oregon. And so that nursery propagates the plants, and then they get shipped to Florida, and they're planted as a bare root transplant. So the plants are about this big and already have roots. And then we plant them into raised beds, and the plants are killed off each year. So for our research studies, we don't keep them around from year to year, because we analyze them in the first year. We flag which ones contain the traits of interest, whether that's disease tolerance or, in my study, photosynthesis. And we make note of what the parents were for that plant, and we can kill off that plant. And there's different stages in breeding. So if the plant contains all of the traits of interest that we're looking for, it'll go to the next stage. But from the initial stage all the way to commercialization, usually it takes about 7 to 10 years.
You just mentioned in passing that at Florida there is no genetically modified
Strawberry.
or research. That to me sounded a little strange, because the very pioneering work in genetic engineering of plants was done at Florida. And is it a policy of IFAS not to do any genetic modification, or what, that they're not using the technique at all?
Yes. So the question was if IFAS contains a policy as to whether or not plants are genetically modified, because maybe in the past or historically, genetic modification of plants has occurred. So within Pioneer here, yes. So the difference would be for actual research purposes. So maybe the plants were genetically modified just for research, but not released to the public. Just so we can like learn methodology and see if it's actually possible, versus the plants that are released to the public. Those ones for my program, for the strawberry breeding program, are not genetically modified. So potentially it could have just been through research and exploration, maybe trying to understand the genetics, but the ones that are actually released and consumed by the public are non-GMO.
I have a question about pesticides and fertilization. When is the last time that you spray before for their pick for harvest?
So strawberry is very susceptible to disease. So there is currently a pathogen called Neopestalotia, and it originated in North Carolina and has spread to Florida. And it's become a really large issue for strawberry producers in the state. And this pathogen can spread through water. And so if you enter a plot that's contaminated with this disease, and you touch the plants, it has like a little brownish hue. And then you enter an uninfected plot, it can spread very quickly. And especially with Florida being so humid and having a lot of water in the air, it's very easy for the pathogen to spread. So they do spray for this disease on a weekly basis. However, I'm not exactly confident on what the time interval is between spraying and harvest and then actual production, or sorry, actual like packaging. They could be washed throughout the process. But I don't know what that timeline exactly looks like. However, we do spray for disease or for pathogens on a weekly basis. So my advice would be to just wash your fruits and vegetables. But it's not also like a risk to the public, because once we spray, there's a re-entry time period. And so humans aren't around when it's sprayed. But then after a certain time of interval, we can enter the fields again. It's safe to enter. So it's not a risk for us or the harvesters. And so downstream, as time passes and you're washing your fruits and vegetables, it's probably okay.
Any further questions? Well, I wasn't really wrong earlier. I'd rather listen to you than Taylor Swift. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you all. Such great questions, too.